Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Garry Schyman. I scored BioShock Infinite. I scored all three of the BioShock games. BioShock Infinite, I guess, is BioShock 3 in a way. I don't think they want to call it that. They've been fantastic games to work on. I'm very grateful to have been involved in these three really, really beautifully made games, and really just been honored that they chose me and that they appreciated my music. Got the gig because I did a game called Destroy All Humans, and the audio director, Emily Ridgway, went to work at Irrational Games and said, "You got to hire Garry Schyman." And so they did. And so it's been a very important part of my career, these three really, really beautiful games. But Infinite really was, BioShock 1 had its own unique style, and BioShock 2 also utilized the style of BioShock 1. It was a true 2. It was set in Rapture, this city under the sea, in the same period. So it really made sense to use the score, or the style of the score, from the original BioShock. But when we got to BioShock Infinite, everyone, including myself, did not want to use the material from BioShock 1 and 2. It just did not make sense. It was a completely unique game. There are parallels, and we'll talk a little bit about that during my presentation today. But really, we had a completely fresh game. It was set in a different period, 1912, in a city in the sky, almost sort of the polar opposite in a way, 180 degrees, and the bright, everything in Rapture was dark and dingy and drippy and wet, and everything in BioShock Infinite is bright and sunny and blazing light. So it really was a different game. I can't not mention the partners that I had in the game. First of all, the entire team at Irrational Games. Unfortunately, they did close their doors, but it's a great development team. Ken Levine, the creative director, is I call him the Steve Jobs of video games. He really is a creative genius, and I love working with him. Jim Bonney was the music director, and Patrick Bothrop was the audio director, and all those guys really did amazing things to make this game, this really, really wonderful game. And I am a contracted composer, so they were in Boston, and I was in LA, basically throwing stuff over the fence and saying, how's this? When we first started, originally, I mean, because BioShock 1 and 2 had been successful, there was no problem getting a budget for an orchestra, a large orchestra. And initially we thought, hey, this is going to be orchestral. You know, what do you want? Want to go to London? Where should we go? And it was like, okay, well, that's all cool and great, but it didn't turn out that way. A lot of things didn't turn out that way. And I think for good reason, and I think I'm grateful that they didn't. The first music, some of the first music I wrote for them was, I wrote a trailer. I wrote the score to a trailer, which was a big presentation trailer. And then they had like like a press release conference, and it was alive, and they showed images from the game, and they wanted me to write some original music. So I'm going to play a little bit of that, just so that this was my initial early concept of what the score might sound like. the end, you hear "My country 'tis of thee" in minor, which, because this is a dystopian world, and it's set in this city that's very American, and everything about it is patriotic, and yet what it is, it's a breakaway city, and it is really sort of a dystopian America. What would happen if everything went horribly wrong? So I thought that was appropriate. But and then I messed around with a lot of different approaches, and it really wasn't until E3. There was an E3 the year before it came out, and they made a presentation there, and they had this AI character called Elizabeth, artificial intelligence, and she was an important character, but not the central character. But the press, everything written about that E3 presentation had Elizabeth, 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 and it became really, really such an important part of what people were discussing on the game that it really had an influence on the whole creative team, and they decided to elevate her character to really your partner in the game. And so this artificial intelligence becomes your partner. And it was at that point that I realized that she was really important, and that I ought to write a theme for her. And so I wrote a theme, but I didn't want, knowing Ken Levine, Ken really responds to live performances. So I said to Jim, I said, I don't really want to send this theme over to anyone. I want to record it live. And he goes, well, we really don't have a budget for that, just to do mock-ups. And I go, well, I'm going to come out of pocket. I really want to record this. So I recorded it with one cello and one viola. We did some overdubs. And so I did this really, really simple tonal triadic theme for her, but it was a important point in the realization for the approach for the entire score. So that simple theme, I sent that to Ken, and Ken really loved it. It really moved him, and it became a realization that I had that, okay, this is the direction for the score. It's not orchestral. This is a really simple score, and this involves really beautifully played, expressive solo instruments, and it somehow expressed the sadness of this world, and expressed its I don't know. I didn't. This is the thing. All throughout the game, they never told me how the game ended. I was scoring the end of the game and didn't understand what it was exactly because they were so secretive. But I knew there was this deep mystery, and so this simple music really was an epiphany for me and an epiphany for everyone in the game. So the realization was, keep it simple. Small string ensembles, not orchestral, and the positive response to live string players that Ken had. And then I did something that I've never done before, and it was really worked on this. I don't know if it would work for any other project, but what I did was I said to Jim, I said, look, we have all this money. We're not going to spend it. I think I have a way that's going to really work for me and for Ken and for you. So I want to record my demos with live players. So, and he said, well, okay, let's try that. He was open to that. So I did a couple of sessions with live players, and Ken was really digging the result. When I'd mock things up, he wasn't digging it or understanding it. When he heard it with live players, it was like, yes, that's it. That sounds great. And it was just a realization. And I've never had more fun than working in that manner. It was just fantastic. I'd write the music, and then a week later, I'd bring a string quartet in, and we'd record for 3 hours. And 2 weeks later, I'd have, and eventually it led me to sort of the ideal string section for the game, which was 10 string players, 3 violins, 3 violas, 3 cellos, and 1 double bass. And that seemed to be sort of like ideal. But before that, I had as few as 3 sessions with string quartet and double bass, just all sorts of different ensembles, and all of them with really great players. It was done in LA. It was done AFM because it was grandfathered in from the old BioShock game, and it was just totally working for him. And it was a really interesting way to really generate really cool music. And really, by the time I was nearly finished scoring it, most of the score had been recorded and was done. There was just an extra session or two that had to be put together. So there were several categories of this game of the music would fit into. Now, there's also all of the source music. I did not write the source music. Jim Bonney hired a bunch of really talented people to do this. A fantastic job on the source music. Really, really brilliant stuff with a barbershop quartet singing Beach Boy songs. Just really cool stuff. And if you play the game and you understand how this game is sort of unstuck in time and anything is possible because time interacts with it in bizarre and crazy ways, they understand how a Beach Boy song could appear in 1912 being sung by a barbershop quartet. But the scripted events are really essentially little vignettes, little movie vignettes that are locked to time. So you could score them like picture. And really, the player has free agency, could walk away from them. And in fact, if you're playing the game for the 4th time, you're probably going to walk away from all the scripted events. But your first time, you're definitely going to watch the scripted events because something important is happening. And so most of these needed to be scored. So I'm going to play. This was a really interesting experiment initially, and really it's once you get up to Columbia, the city in the sky, you end up in this little grotto, and then you open the door, and there is Columbia, and it's beautiful. It's really beautiful. It's like, it's not a dark place. At least at this point, I did not want the music to be scary at all. And yet, I didn't want the music just to be, happy-go-lucky. So what I did was I listened to Stephen Foster songs for a couple of days. Stephen Foster being the great American songwriter of the 19th century, and maybe there's a little New World Symphony. And I wrote this really simple, pretty melody with some simple chord changes. But then underneath it, I added a chromatic, sort of slithery second layer that I thought represented what potentially is going to come at you in this city. So. So, and I used the video you see here is what I composed to. I just took that video and I thought it appropriate to bring that video. So I just thought I'd show you this. I decided, because I only had 10 players and because I wasn't sure how this was going to work when I recorded it, I thought I need to separate the tonal part from the chromatic part. So here just really is just a very simple, with just sustained chords. Alyssa Park was the first violinist, and she's just playing this really beautifully sweet solo, poco vibrato. And I decided to do very little with the accompaniment, with the tonal part, because I didn't think the accompaniment, I thought if I made it busy, it would be fighting the other chromatic part. All right, so that's that. And then here's a look at the chromatic parts. So this chromatic part is actually quite complex, but played pianissimo, so that it didn't fight it. But basically, it's all strings. I used a little celesta as well. And I thought, as I was separating them, I thought maybe there's a spot. And one thing to realize as a composer for a video game is that there's no music, rarely, or there's not always, but a lot of music can get utilized in different spots. So I thought, okay, I can deliver both these to Jim, and he can use this in some other spot in the game. And I think he did. I'm not absolutely certain of that. So that was that experiment, and it really worked quite nicely. That music won the Gang Award for Instrumental Music of the Year last year, so that was all very cool. And then there was another interesting aspect to the score, and that was there's these characters called the Lutece twins, and they are sort of in on the joke. They really kind of know what's happening throughout all these different permutations of time and interactions. And so they're sort of talking in what appears to be nonsense all the time, which only makes sense when you get to the end of the game and you realize that they know what all the different possibilities, and that really in this alternative world there's like millions or perhaps an infinite, thus the term infinite, possibilities of how things can turn out. And in the end, it does, the Booker character which you play, the solution is that he has to die. And that's the only way to end it from being a tragic story. But here's the Lutece twins.
Well, at least
sort of a tango.
Invented the technology that allows the city to float.
Giant balloons.
Quantum particles, suspended in space-time at a fixed height.
So, not giant balloons?
But the thing is, my book said they disappeared several years ago.
I don't.
You sure that's right? Something tells me they're not exactly what they appear.
I was going to have to become
No.
subjunctive.
That's not subjunctive.
I don't think the syntax is good.
A little bit of accordion in there.
We seemed to have good minds.
Sometimes.
Finish each other's sentences.
Exactly.
Beyond the forbidden.
How do you suppose
You
they
can see the Lutece twins are in all these
Back to
different
you
places
after
that you cross, and you don't.
city bed.
It doesn't make any sense until you understand that they're just completely unstuck in time and can do whatever the hell they want. And then finally, I thought it was interesting. This is the one spot in the game where the music in BioShock Infinite actually was similar to the original score because you end up in Rapture. If you've played the game, you know you end up briefly in the city of Rapture because Elizabeth has this power to open tears, literally tear. She can open a tear in time, and when in danger, you can kind of dive through it. And they end up actually in Rapture, and they take a ride in a bathysphere, which is this submarine. So I wrote a cue that kind of sounded like Rapture music, from my original score. open fifth sound, which is something used in the Elizabeth theme, became sort of an motif throughout the score.
God, you're beautiful.
Which
The stars.
Come on, it's this way. Come on.
Are you going to open it?
It's no good. Damn it. I thought once we were here, I could fully
So that or motif gets used throughout the game because to me it sort of represented the infinite. There's something magical about a fifth. It's in relationship to the Overtone series. So that ostinato figure literally appears in a lot of cues throughout the game, and worked quite nicely as tying together. It's a simple technique, but it just worked really beautifully. And then I wrote, they needed some mood music. They needed some ambient music. So I decided that I would use some extended techniques and write some aleatory for this. And I thought I'd show you just a few of the cues. And these I handed off to Jim and said, just use these wherever you need some mood, just whatever. And this is all done with small string ensembles. And if you think you need, and one lesson here is if you think you need a large string ensemble to do extended techniques, you really don't. A lot can be done with a string quartet. Just simple chords using quarter tone detuning. Let's move on. Just creating some mood. Well, I think this is the last one. And as this moves along, they get more and more out of tune, quarter tone wise. The oscillation gets wider and wider. Very effective and very helpful. So combat music became a really interesting struggle in this game because even though I had found this idea and that everyone seemed really pleased with, which was to use these small string ensembles, there still was the feeling that combat music has to have large resources, that we had to have an orchestra to really play combat, to really make that work. And so I'm going to play, I did a few combat cues, and it was really, the controversy was apparently raging in Boston, little known to the rest of the country, about whether this combat music had to be orchestral or not. And people were sort of like fighting Ken on it. Ken was feeling that the orchestral wasn't working. So I'm going to play, here's an orchestral cue. I know the video is very fuzzy, but this is what I was writing to. These are just samples because we didn't have an orchestra. We didn't record this with orchestra. So, all right. So, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that piece of combat music for this chaotic combat sequences that were common in BioShock. But Ken was feeling that it was not unique enough. And I remember from when I first started working on the original BioShock, Emily called me and said, okay, she goes, here's the direction for the score. It can't sound like any other film, game, or TV score ever heard before. A little intimidating, okay? Well, sort of this is the same direction, okay? It can't sound like any film, TV, or game show before. So I started experimenting around with small ensembles. What can be done combat-wise with small ensembles? And I think it became actually a very interesting technique. So here's a combat cue. Footage that they gave me to score to. So this is not the picture. You get the idea. All right, so it's very annoying, but it really worked great in the game. It really worked great. It really helped create this sense of things are completely out of control. It really facilitated what we wanted to accomplish in this game in terms of the combat music. And there's several different genres of this, but essentially what I did was I created this really repetitive percussion ostinato figures, and I just kept them going. I just relentless. They're just relentless. And then over that, added these figures, these aleatoric figures, sometimes rhythmic figures using the strings. And I'm going to show you how I accomplished that. And I played we did bring in a percussionist one day, but I played much of the percussion, and I didn't quantize it either. I kept it very ragged because my thinking on it was like a drum circle at Venice Beach. Have any of you ever been to Venice Beach? It's like a bunch of guys smoking dope, playing drums, okay? And it's not necessarily quantized. And I thought that would be really effective here. That it's almost like just a bunch of guys getting their nerve up to go kill a bunch of other guys. And so, and I thought that kind of worked. So it was just me just playing this stuff in unquantized. Every now and then I'd be so I'd nudge a note a little bit. So that was also part of the approach on it. So what I did was I wrote tons of little short, aleatoric, intense moments, and I'm going to show you a few. Just nails on chalkboard type of cues, you know. And then here's another example basically just taking all these little bits of aleatory and sort of just massaging them together and making them work and overlapping them in any ways that felt creative to me. So it's like really grating, but it really worked wonders in combat because it just created this sense of complete chaos, and it's frightening. And that was really what they wanted to achieve. And it was all done really using these small string ensembles. It really, so I learned something. I was fighting for the orchestral combat music. Of course, I like to have an orchestra to record with too, so maybe there was a bit of selfishness there. But really, I really felt that you can't have combat without an orchestra, in this context. But I was wrong. And Ken was right, and it is a lesson to be learned that very often your creative partners, the people you're working with, they know your game, their game, better than you know their game. You are a partner, and sometimes you have some good ideas, and they'll totally recognize it when you come up with them. But sometimes they know something. Well, they weren't telling me how the game ended either. So, they knew something, and Ken in particular is this just brilliant guy, and he just is very intuitive. He can't say, well, it needs to be aleatoric with small string ensembles and a ragged percussion track. He can't say that, but because he doesn't have that musical knowledge. But he'll tell you when he doesn't like something. And so it really pushed me to create these sorts of, these are just, and the interesting thing, another thing that I learned was you would think if you doubled it, it would make it more intense. How many think it gets more intense when you double it? Well, it doesn't. It gets less intense because it takes all the jagged edges off, and because they're all going to be flamming with one another, and so really it was a single pass that was the most effective. And I would double these, and we'd listen back and go, whoa, it doesn't sound as intense. It's like really not driving anymore. So, it became clear that these instruments play with this sort of dry intensity and like a ton in your face, and a single pass was much more effective than just doubling or tripling. I mean, I could have taken out 10 strings and made them 30, but it wasn't effective. Write words like scream on top of the track, and then let them scream. So, a couple more. Violent, intense. So just really annoying stuff, okay? The more annoying, the better. And the players were a little annoyed by it too at times, but it really just worked so well. I think. So here's another. Then there was another. Well, let me see. This. Play a little bit. Just a little bit of some of those techniques. You can hear some of the stuff you just heard, and me just sort of creating a montage out of it, and using them and doubling them, and literally taking the audio, putting it into my DAW and just moving it around until it made sense to me. All right. And then there was another type of combat cue, which was really sort of written out, sort of through composed. And really it involved using just sort of like violent string ostinatos. So here's... Again, though, with these repetitive drum, Venice Beach, Stones drums. I actually thought of going to Venice Beach to see if I could get them. But then I thought the Romanis temple was. Felt better of that idea. I would have got my ass kicked. Ken also said something, because I mean, composer in me wants these types of cues to be to change and Jerry Goldsmith was one of my great teachers. I mean, I didn't study with him privately or anything, but just listening to his music, and when he did comedy music, he would just like all of a sudden go to something quite different and then do something else. But Ken didn't want that. He really wanted what I'd call like musical meatloaf. Like wherever you cut it, it's kind of the same. It's here or there's sort of, you know. And he was right, because he really felt like if this music is changing too much, it's going to sound like you're catching things, and he didn't want that. He knew his game, and he pushed me to do some really brilliant things, I think. And then there was just the final is just layered combat, because there were times in the game when the character would be fighting these, you know, game characters, and he would Booker would duck away, you know, and kind of get away from it. So basically, just cross-fade to a less intense version of the same track. And there are three layers. There's active, passive, and then what Jim called turtling, like literally a turtle getting in a shell. So here's just some example. Here would be the active. There was a lot of combat music. And so then here would be the passive version. Much less intense. It's completely in sync tempo-wise, but basically so you can easily crossfade back and forth between that track and the other combat, the full active version. A simple technique, but it worked well here. And then turtling. In the turtling, I added some tension strings, because the percussion is almost gone. Everything is almost gone. So I just felt it needed some kind of tension. So I actually added this extra layer of tension strings. But again, totally in sync with the other two cues. So you could easily ramp it up to the full octave within a bar, and you're there. A couple of things that I would recommend in sort of like closing here, and before I take some questions from you guys. I've always tried, when possible, to suggest music that I just somehow intuitively feel it would be useful for the game. I just have some sense that, hey, this cue, and thus the Elizabeth cue, which was sort of a realization that, hey, this team has found the center of this game now through the Elizabeth character. Now I have to write some music for it. And that was an epiphany for myself in terms of finding the style for the game, and also in terms of Ken really going, yes, this is it. This is the style for this. And there was another cue I did that was called AD, which is literally originally I was thinking, well, maybe I need to write a Booker theme. So I wrote this, and they liked this music a lot, but at first they had nowhere to put it. And then Jim says, I found a spot for it. So he ended up using it in this moment where you find out really how Elizabeth gets unstuck in time, because she's going. It's complex. It's not worth going into it, but if you played the game, you know it's this really complex set of circumstances where it only makes sense actually when you go to Wikipedia and read. No, I'm kidding. It does make sense, but it's complex. It's like really complex, and really I had to read online like, oh, okay, I see now. It all totally makes sense, because it's a really, I mean, one of the things that Irrational is and has been really good at is this story, you know, and so they created a very complex story. But I just thought I'd sort of play the AD theme, which is originally the Booker theme. This morning, I told a story of something I read years ago that's always stuck with me and it's always helped me. And it was something that Igor Stravinsky said. And he said that, and he wrote at the piano. That's where he didn't have any samples. So he wrote at the piano, and he said, if you point to the piano and say, start writing, because I don't know where to start. I have no idea. It's infinite. No pun intended. But if you play 2 notes, I can start composing immediately. And so, and that always struck me as really critical and something that we need to think about is whether any kind of creative aspect of games or anything really. It's like get started, find your 2 notes, find something, and then take that and then see where that leads you. And so this is really how I found my 2 notes in this game, and it was a fantastic experience. I received the BAFTA for this score, which was incredible. I wish I'd gone to London. I didn't, unfortunately, because I didn't know if I'd win or not. And I was actually the end of that week. I was heading up to Seattle to record a Shadow, the Mordor game. So. In any event, it's been all 3 of the games. I don't know if they'll make another BioShock. I hope they do, but I'm not. I'm kind of think Ken has gone on to different stories to tell. So in any event, if you have questions, I'm happy to take some questions from you guys. Thank you.
Great presentation, thank you.
Thank you.
With the smaller ensemble, you mentioned earlier that it can be not intimidating, but it can be preferable to use a large orchestra for combat music.
I thought.
Right. Was part of that part of that transition in the way of thinking influenced by, in the games like BioShock where you have so many different sound effects considerations with the vigors or plasmids, all the different weapon sounds. I found that, when I was playing Infinite, I thought that the music really cut through a tremendous amount because of the less that was going on in terms of not as many timbres getting buried by a gunshot, et cetera. Do you think that
I do think that worked. I wasn't conscious of that because I was sending music to Jim, and Jim was implementing it and going, yeah, this is working. Or if there was a problem with it, okay, it's working up to here, you need to fix it, and he'd tell me why. And it is sort of like the contractor's dilemma. I mean, you aren't in-house. You're sort of doing the best you can from afar. But there is an advantage to being in-house as well. But yeah, I do think that definitely was very effective in helping that. But again, I mean, it's just always be open to a paradigm shift. That's another thing that I just keep telling myself, because no matter how certain you are of this is the way something ought to be done, you need to be open to the possibility that something that completely different. I mean, Gustav Mahler said, in his late 50s, I'm always the student. He's always learning something new. So I learned something new in this, and I learned it from the development team, who, especially Ken, who just kept pushing until he got what he wanted. And then I'm like, yes, this is frickin' awesome. This is great. So
Great, thank you.
Sure.
That was a great presentation. Thanks for
Thank you.
sharing with us. My question is, when you're writing this aleatory music that is so intensely emotional and dependent on the performance, how do you cope with not knowing exactly how it's going to sound until you get to the studio?
Well, I mean, you have to do a study of aleatoric music. You have to have some sense of how it's going to sound. If you've never written anything aleatoric, or you haven't studied the scores of the great aleatoric composers, then you may in fact kind of make some mistakes and find yourself with unsatisfactory results. So I felt fairly confident that what I had written was going to be effective. And then you're there, you talk to the players and you adjust. If something's not working, you just go, okay, just let's try that down a fifth, because it's just not quite working in that register. Or can you give that any more? At one point I asked that, and then one of the bass players broke his bow, and he just left. He was so pissed. He was doing Colenio, and I'm just thinking, you should use a pencil for that or a piece of wood. But in any event, so yeah, you adjust on the scene, and so. But I think you need to do some study of it so that you are confident that you're not wasting your time. But in this context, we had the money, so if anything really didn't work, there was lots of stuff that ended up on the cutting room floor that just didn't quite work. But we had we knew we were on the right direction. So if every single aleatoric little vignette was not useful, then so be it. That's okay too.
Hi, Gary. Congratulations on a great achievement.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Actually, following up on the aleatoric element, a lot of us would face the actual predicament of having to have the music reviewed before going to the studio to record it. So we would face the issue of having to try and mock up these.
This is the fix. Hire small string ensembles.
Yeah, but obviously, like, to have, even before you go to the studio, to have the game director hear your music beforehand. How do you mock it?
Well, yes, that is a challenge if you haven't. I now have a whole library of stuff that I can sort of draw on to use as placeholders until it gets replaced. But you literally could go anywhere in the literature and take snippets of music and use it as placeholders. Say, this is kind of what I want to achieve. Okay. So I would say, as long as it doesn't end up in the game, I think that's a perfectly cool thing to do. And there are also, like Symphobia and other libraries do have pre-rendered aleatoric tracks. Problem with those is that so many of them have been heard a lot on television and used incessantly. Right. So I try not to use them, even though some of them are quite good, because they just feel worn out. So, exactly. And by the way, you can take traditional samples and you can do things with them, detune them, and do some really creative things with them. So, and if you just can bring in one player, bring in a violinist, and then overdub and create some effects.
Yeah, it wouldn't sound even close to how effective that is when you actually have those musicians together and they're playing their instrument that way.
Right, but you look, you have to wing it to some extent, So you have to experiment, and you have to really try to find, and maybe the answer is to find some things from that pre-existing tracks and say this is going to get replaced by something similar.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
So one of the most effective elements of BioShock Infinite's music for me was at the ending flourish when combat is over and all the enemies have been defeated. And I thought you might get into this, but you actually didn't. So I was just curious, was that your idea? Was that something you talked with Ken and Jim about? Like, how did that particular flourish at the end of combat come about?
Wait, in which cue?
The ending, when all the enemies are defeated, and there's sort of that dissonant, like, I'm not even
right.
Sure
The stab.
Yeah. It's this very effective. I'm not a musician, so I just hear it. Just for me, it was an incredibly effective notion that combat is ended. This period of intensity has ended, and now you're safe. So do you recall what at that point in the game or in that point in combat?
You'd have to play that for me so that I recall exactly what they requested there.
Yeah.
But
in that case, would it have been that something that they requested then? Or?
Yes, they would have requested that. And Jim sometimes he asked for stingers that he ended up using in different spots that I wasn't even aware of.
Yeah.
So I had literally probably spent an hour just doing stingers. Yeah. And I wrote tons and tons and tons of them, and then we recorded them, and then just use them any way you want.
Got it. Well, it was very effective nonetheless. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi. During the combat music, I found a lot of it when I was personally playing that a lot of the percussive elements and even the strings in the way that they would interact with each other sounded quite a bit like alarms. Was that a conscious decision, or was that just sort of a happy accident that, it sort of sounded like an old fire bell from that era, or like the old crank sirens that were on fire trucks at that point, that just the choices made felt like they were conscious as opposed to just like, oh, great, that worked?
Well, I wasn't thinking about that, and I didn't actually use any old alarms. I certainly had some metal percussion instruments that possibly, were what you were thinking of when you heard those, and I would, have them banging away. It would probably just me playing. Although one day I did bring in a percussionist and had him play all day, and that was a great experience. But it turned out that I have a lot of percussion, and the percussion was working. And by the way, we really were fighting against not wanting to have the big Hans Zimmerish drums. We wanted small drums and smaller instruments, just like that some human being might actually be playing in the real world. Again, back to my Venice Beach sort of analogy. But we wanted, they didn't need to be these giant. As a matter of fact, those were too cinematic and Ken actually would reject those. So we went with smaller instruments, smaller drums, and sometimes Jim would record some drum and send it to me. He goes, I think this is really cool. And I'd go, okay, and I'd make a whole sample library out of it and would use it. And they were pretty simple sounding. It might just be a tom-tom, like a basic tom-tom, like from an Indian tom-tom or something like that. But there was just something cool about that just was very effective. We just upset the apple cart and went in a direction that was quite different, and I thought it was very effective.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi. Very early on in the combat in the game, there's a sequence of events as Booker's firing his pistol. First it's just a shot, and then it's a shot with a piano stab, and then the third shot is with orchestral or string layers. How did that come about? I think it's brilliant. It invokes fear at first and then empowerment.
That's probably Jim Bonney just taking my material and using it in really creative, cool ways.
Cool. Yeah,
so
it seemed to cross between being music and sound design and implementation.
Yeah, he was. That's the cool thing about having a full-time music director like Nathan. They can focus totally on the music and think about it sometimes for a year or two. So very creative solutions like that can be found. And he was asking for a lot of different things from me, some of which I didn't even know how exactly they'd get used, and didn't know until I saw them in use. So.
Cool. Thanks.
Sure.
Hey, first off, I want to thank you for composing Lighter Than Air. It's fantastic. My question is one of inspiration. I guess in sort of some unfair comparisons, the combat music is like that of Johnny Greenwood, and for me especially, it's sort of the There Will Be Blood score where that oil derrick is burning down, and sort of I've seen that compared in a few articles, and I know that Mr. Levine is a huge film head. So in terms of inspiration, do you ever look at anything like that, or do you try to keep everything that's been done before?
I like that score for Let There Be Blood. I was writing aleatoric music before that score existed, certainly. So it wasn't an epiphany for me to hear that score, but I thought it was very effective. I love that score for that Johnny Greenwood score. It's very cool.
Thanks.
Hi, Gary. It's sort of similar to his question, but I was curious for either the aleatoric elements or the more tonal string writing, did you look to any classical pieces for inspiration to
Well, I listened to a lot of Stephen Foster for the 1Q that and also the New World Symphony, because I thought that had a very Americana vibe to it, and also Charles Ives.
Oh, okay.
As well, because I thought, Charles Ives really wrote a lot of really cool Americana music. So those were also inspirations for me.
That's great. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks for this.
Sure.
Regarding the whole montage of aleatoric, these little aleatoric pieces, and you mentioned putting them together in different ways. Did you ever have them or the music system actually sort of splice them in a random fashion, or were they always you sort of placing them together in the way that sounded best?
No, I really picked them out very specifically for their effectiveness. I don't think a music system would have put them together in a creative way. It's possible that they could if you program the hell out of it, you might find some really cool way to do that. But that was not what was done in this case. It was really me just overlapping and just finding something that just really felt chaotic and crazy and effective.
Awesome. Thanks.
Sure.
Hi.
Hi.
First of all, thank you very much for the music of BioShock. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
So when you approached Infinite, did you really want it to, and I know that there was a level in Infinite that actually had Rapture in it, but did you approach it sort of wanting it to feel like an extension of the BioShock universe? Like, did you want it to have music similar enough to the first one that it was relatable, or did you sort of want it to be its own new thing?
No, it needed to be, and I wanted it to be a completely fresh and unique score, because it's other than that one cue where you actually end up in Rapture, it really, as far as I was concerned, and certainly as far as the entire team at Irrational, it needed to have its own unique sound. Okay. It really did.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hey, some more quick question. So I noticed you got a lot of crazy sounds out of the strings. So were there any things that just kind of like came up in the studio just unplanned that you just kind of kept in because you liked it?
What, say that again?
Like, I know you said you planned out a lot of the bizarre string parts.
Yeah.
But I was asking if there's anything that like just kind of came up that you didn't plan that you really liked and just kind of kept.
Yeah, you get surprises all that. When you're recording live instruments, especially stuff like this, you do get surprises. And then you say, hey, whatever you just did, do that again. That was very cool. Yeah, and that is the beauty of working with real musicians. I love that part of it, because you never know what they're going to come up with. You never know how they're going to take your music and do some really cool, unique thing that you did not expect. And I want that from the players, the live players that I work with. I want them to experiment and to try unique things. And that's the best. That's the most fun part.
Thank you.
Sure. All right. Well, thank you all. Thanks for coming.